Thank you very much for having me today. As was said, I do know a little bit about networks, but I'm not a network professional. I'm not an economist. I'm not a social capital expert. So my talk is really going to draw on my experiences and a little bit of research. I do have a sociology background, so I'll insert some of that into the talk. And I'm going to actually employ modern technology. So when you see me looking at my phone, I'm not tweeting or responding to emails. I'm actually just cheating a little bit and referring to my speech this way. So when you see the social network at the title of my talk, you might think about Facebook or any other kind of online social network. You might also think a little bit about other forms of online networking, and that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about how, as a city, or as a city region, we are, in fact, a social network. We are connected in a lot of ways, and in some ways, we aren't connected. But what we do know is that these social networks do help us build a stronger, more cohesive society. So how can we do that? And how can institutions like the ones that you represent here today be part of that process? In 2006, as was noted in the introduction, I had the privilege of joining an organization then known as the Toronto City Summit Alliance. It's today known as the Greater Toronto Civic Action Alliance. This coalition of business leaders, academic leaders, nonprofit executives, and public sector leaders came together to develop a series of initiatives that help improve various aspects of the Toronto region. In working on some of these initiatives, it became increasingly clear how important networks can be in that process, but also how important networks can be for people outside of the process around city building. One specific segment are job seekers. So if we think exclusively about how people go about finding jobs, we can see how networks play a role. But more important, or in addition to the role that a person obtains through the job seeking process, it's also important for us to think about the other auxiliary roles that come about once one has a job. We think about volunteer leadership roles. We think about other roles in society. So really that piece around obtaining a job is so important. The other reason why I want to use the job seeker as a platform for my conversation is that I think each one of us can recall, and that's not my phone, each one of us can recall the process of looking for a job. So I want you to just think back for a moment to your first job. And let's exclude your paper route if that was your first job. But let's think about the first summer job you were able to get. You might have done some kind of canvassing. You might have worked as a lifeguard. You might have done some work in retail. But in addition to thinking about that job, I want you to think about how you got that job. Did you apply for it? Did someone's parents talk to someone that they know to get you access to that job? Did you hear about it through some other means? In my case, my first summer job was with an organization called Thistletown Community Services Unit, and it was located in Jamestown, in North Etobicoke, where I grew up. And I heard about it through another student who had seen a sign in our school. The unit, as it was known, provides all kinds of social services to people in the Jamestown community. And at this particular point in time, they were looking to engage students in their summer garden, their community garden work. And not that I was any kind of expert gardener or really had any interest in gardening, I just thought this would be a kind of a neat opportunity. And so I applied and got the job. And interestingly enough, that summer job turned into 4 more years of working with the organization as their after-school coordinator. And I mention this mostly because that job not only gave me, an income for that period of time, but it also was my first introduction to how networks work in a community. And it also provided me with the basis of a network and the basis of a way of looking at the world. I want you to think about your second and your third job and how they connected, if at all, to the first job that you were able to obtain, and how then that network began to develop for yourself personally. And I share these stories, I ask you these questions because I know that every single one of us in this room has gone through that process at one point or another. But to institutions like yours, I think there are 3 ways that you can act as a conduit to developing these networks. And there are a number of reasons why developing networks are so important to your institutions. 1, they act as points of knowledge transfer. 2, they act as sources of new resources, perspectives. And 3, they can act as sources of new information. That said, in my experiences has shown that you can only achieve these benefits if you are able to create networks that have the following characteristics in place. The first, networks being strengthened by the entry of new actors. And here comes my sociology moment. When I interviewed for the job at Civic Action, I interviewed in the second interview with the chair of the organization, a gentleman named David Pico. And I was struck by the fact that David did not have an MBA, and yet he was managing partner of this huge management consultancy, the Boston Consulting Group. And we vibed over the fact that we both were familiar with Mark Granovetter's work. And Mark Granovetter is a theorist who talks a lot about networks and how they can be opened or closed. And in the diagram that you see on the screen here, it depicts how networks can be closed, and that will be your image on the right, on my right, or how they can be, open is on my right, and how they can be closed on my left. The risk around network closure, or how networks are closed, occurs when the actors within the network are very similar to one another. And as such, their own networks then become very closely related to each other, and so they end up facing inward, as opposed to networks that are open, that face outward. And you can imagine which one of these networks is most beneficial to organizations that are addressing complex problems. It's the networks that are open. So as you think about your own institutions as one sort of knob in that network chart, consider whether your networks are open. Consider whether the organizations that you most closely work with and associate with are very similar to your own. Consider the leaders that you connect with most regularly. Are they similar to yourselves? Consider the geographic vicinities that they come from. Think about the socioeconomic groups that they represent. And look for that diversity amongst them. And I think that's the way we can get to more open networks. The second point is new actors can only enter networks that are permeable. And here I go back to my experience looking for that first job. And the organization, this tiny community agency that I was working for that wanted to really expand its network, that said, let's look at the high school nearby and see if there may be people there that may want to connect with us and build our network that way. I think that if that kind of interaction or that kind of intentionality did not exist, that opportunity would have eluded myself and others. The third, networks can only be permeable if they have specific and accessible points of contact. I mentioned that in addition, I mentioned that again in the job search example, but when you think also about the kinds of leadership opportunities that can be created by institutions, your boards, your committees of boards, councils, advisory councils that you might be creating, those can all serve as access points into your networks. However, if we're operating within a closed network structure, we find that we're not getting the true benefits of what networks can provide to us. As I mentioned earlier, I had the privilege of working with Toronto City Summit Alliance, now known as the Greater Toronto Civic Action Alliance. And when I joined, we were just developing an initiative called the Emerging Leaders Network. And in a lot of ways, this was thought of to be sort of the succession plan for the organization. At the time, there was a steering committee of 50 leaders. Some of you in the room were part of that group of 50. Each member of the steering committee was invited to, or asked to invite a person they felt was an emerging leader to be part of this group. So this group began with 50 individuals. Among that 50 was a young woman who had been invited to participate in the very first initiative of this group, which was their 2002 summit. Her name is Mitzi Hunter. She in effect grew up in the organization, contributed to a number of different initiatives, and as time would go on, she became the chair of the Emerging Leaders Network. She continued in that role for several years, And in fact, she is now the CEO of Civic Action. You see a picture of her there with Chair John Tory. I give you this example to, again, just demonstrate how these networks, how open networks can provide the additional perspectives, new resources, and in this case, replenish leadership. Second example I want to give you is in my current role at TO 2015, the organizing committee for the Pan and the Para-Pan Am Games. At TO 2015, we are operating on a deadline. We're very deadline driven. July 2015 is going to come and the games have to go on whether we're ready or not. And in fact, we're 142 weeks away. So we're very, very focused on the deadline. And in addition to that, we're very focused on the fact that we are stewarding funds. We're stewarding government funds, and we're doing something that is not only a major sporting event, but it is in a lot of ways a city-building initiative. So as we're developing the organization, we're very mindful of the need to truly expand our networks, and we're doing that through the committees of our board. We're doing that through a number of advisory councils that we've set up. We have about 16 advisory councils in place at present. And having those councils and having the insights of the individuals on those councils provide us with the information that we need to ensure that our games are relevant and meaningful for our community. And as I've only been with the organization since January, but it's really brought to light for me this notion of organizations acting with the end in mind. And I put that out to everyone here. What if we all operated our organizations with the end in mind? Would it create in us the need to be more intentional around our network formation? Because thinking with the end in mind means that we're thinking about how our work, the mission of our organizations, how that piece of things remains sustainable. So it's not about the organization living on, but more about the work of our organization living on. I leave that thought with you today as you think about how you want to expand and create more diverse networks. Thank you.